Welcome to week 8 in psychosocial aspects of sport. This week we are talking about race and sport, and I'll get to that more in a minute. Last week we talked about gender sexuality in sport, and I will be grading the two things that were due last week, which is you had a quiz, and then there was another trend analysis presentation on a specific aspect of that topic. So I'll be looking at that this week. You may notice that I graded the discussion questions from the previous week when we talked about deviance in sport. We had two different discussion questions. The first looked at aspects of positive addiction. So I really enjoyed seeing everybody's application of the 3 stages of positive addiction to whatever activity it was that you maybe saw in your own sport experience. For a lot of people, that was basketball skill acquisition. I thought that was a really good example of some of the ways that positive addiction goes through kind of a series of stages in developing a positive addiction to that activity. The second discussion question asked you to look at to pick an act of deviance in sport and answer 2 questions based on evidence. Those 2 questions were whether that act of deviance is increasing or decreasing. And then the second question was whether that act of deviance was more prevalent in sport, in athletes, than in the general population. So and let's look at an example. An example of that might be hazing. So let's say that you looked at hazing and you decided that you told me that hazing was increasing. But if you didn't cite a source that gave statistics that hazing was increasing, then I don't know that you didn't just make that up. So I can't tell that your comment that hazing was increasing was evidence-based. So if you didn't provide a source that specifically backed up your statement, then I have to assume that you just made it up. So if you saw points taken away, then it was because maybe you provided a source, but your source maybe talked about a specific example of hazing, rather than if hazing was increasing or decreasing. So that's how I was looking for you to use your evidence, your sources. Otherwise, I am just forced to assume that you made up the idea that hazing was either increasing or decreasing. So this week we're talking about race and sport, and I'm presenting 2 things in your material this week. The first thing is that we're looking at race in a social construct. That is, race is kind of defined by the meanings that we give it in our society rather than biological characteristics. But we are going to look at an article that brings us up to speed on biological characteristics between races and how those may or may not affect athletic ability. So that's our first article, is just looking at some research on that specific topic. And then the second thing I'm presenting this week is looking at the concept of race and in-group bias. And in-group bias is a psychological concept which basically means that we take our own groups, whatever groups we're in. Maybe it's our religion, maybe it's our team, and maybe it's our race. And we may favor our own group versus the other group, whether it's the opposing team or another religion or whatever that other group is. So we're going to be looking at the concept of in-group bias and how that specifically may apply to race and race and sport. So this week what is due is discussion questions 6, as well as it's our last trend analysis presentation. So please don't forget that you need to comment on 2 of your classmates' presentations, and there are some specific parameters that I want your responses to have. You may want to look back at the assignment and refresh yourself on what I'm looking for in those responses. And I haven't graded those yet. I'll be grading those at the end. So once all of your responses are in, I'll be grading those. So I hope that you have a great week. Spring break is coming up. We're almost there. So hang in there. Have a good week. And thank you for your work in this class.